Hello class, today we are going to be talking about the female reproductive system, and we're doing anatomy. Now, like I said, in the male section, the female one is way more complex, but by the same token, it's also way more interesting. And the main reason for this is not only does the female system have to do what the male system does in terms of produce gametes, introduce those gametes during sexual reproduction, create that zygote, the female system also has to support the developing embryo, provide nourishment for the growing infant, both in terms of the embryo for the 9 months as it is carried in the uterus, and then later provide nourishment in the form of breast milk. Because of this, the female system has a lot more moving pieces. But let's start with the internal female genitalia, which is a much better designed system than the male genitalia, because for the female, everything is protected on the inside. Now, these genitalia include ovaries, which is your thing that is going to produce your gametes, your uterine tubes, your uterus, and the vagina. Now, let's get a little bit deeper into these sections. So, the ovaries are the paired female gonads on the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity. These are essentially akin to the testicles in men. They produce the ova, which is the gamete for the female. They secrete hormones, estradiol, estrone, estrol, as well as progesterone, inhibin, and relaxin. Now, in terms of this exam, estradiol, progesterone, inhibin, and I guess relaxin will be important. Don't worry about these two. They are other forms of estradiols, which, for the purpose of this class, not going to be important. However, endocrinology is so cool. It's the study of essentially hormones. Super fascinating class. Highly recommend that you take it. Now, you have the ovarian cortex, which is the superficial region where oogenesis, the production of gametes, occurs within sac-like follicles. These develop and mature with gametes. Now, again, when I took this class and everything, I like to try to see any similarities between the systems because then it's easier to compare and contrast. So, oogenesis is the production of gametes for the female. Spermatogenesis is the production of gametes in a male. You have that genesis in there, and then depending on what the gamete is, sperm or ovum, that's the precursor term. Ovarian medulla, the inner region where the blood vessels, lymphatic vesicles, and nerves are found. So, another parallel. You've seen the word cortex and medulla in the urinary system previously when we were describing the kidney. Cortex is on the outside, medulla is on the inside. We have the uterine tubes, which are commonly called the fallopian tubes. Another term for them are the oviducts. These essentially form the initial segment of the reproductive system where the ovaries connect into the uterus. It's at the proximal end of the tube, the isthmus, essentially this section right in here. And if you see the ovary is here, the ovum or gamete is released into this tube, and that's the site where fertilization mostly occurs. Again, if you want a little bit of comparisons, think about it similar to the ductus deferens in the male, which would carry sperm out of the epididymis. Here we have the ovary that will release an egg and go through the uterine tube. The uterus, the womb. This is essentially the pathway for sperm to enter the uterine tubes. It provides the site for the newly fertilized ovum to implant itself into that wall where it can be protected and nourished at the same time. They're comprised of 3 regions: the body, the fundus, and the cervix. So, uterus or womb right in here. The cervix is right here, which is going to be the separation between the vagina and the uterus. You have the body and the head. Now, there is layers to it. There is the peritoneum. This is the outermost layer, and it's this extension of the parietal pineum. Myometrium, endometrium. Middle, inner. Now, in anatomy, we've talked about the endo layer for a long time. That's the innermost. You have the myo, medium. peri, most commonly on the outside, the peritoneum. Now, myometrium. It's the middle layer composed of bunches of smooth muscle that contract rhythmically during childbirth and orgasm. Endometrium is the innermost layer. These are comprised of simple columnar epithelium. It forms the mucous membrane that rests on the thin layer of tissue. Later, we are going to talk about the hormonal cycle and the menstrual cycle in the female, where you will figure out which of these layers is essentially sloughed off, creating the period, or the menses, when you are not pregnant. Ovulation. So an immature gamete, called an oocyte, is expelled from the ovary. The fibrae sweep the ovary to catch the oocyte and direct it into the uterine tube. Now, the fertilization, remember, that's when gamete and gamete meet and create a zygote. That's fertilization. So that begins when a sperm cell binds and penetrates the oocyte plasma membrane. Typically occurs in the ampulla. Vagina. This is an organ of copulation, similar to the penis in terms of helping assist those gametes to meet each other. So the vagina has to receive the penis and semen during sexual intercourse, and it's the passageway both for giving birth and menstrual flow to remove the excess layers of the uterus when pregnancy does not occur. The vagina is a thick-walled tube that extends from the cervix to the exterior of the body. If you remember, the cervix is the top of the the bottom of the uterus that separates the uterus from the vagina. It is parallel to the urethra, which lies between the urinary bladder and the rectum. So where men only essentially have one tube for pee and sperm, women have two. They have the urethra specifically for urine, and they have the vagina specifically for semen. And a baby in the opposite direction. Same with blood. Vaginal mucosa is comprised of stratified squamous epithelium. It's able to withstand frictional forces. Wrong words again. Frictional forces. Mucus from the cervix provides lubrication. Now, ask your parent about frictional forces and everything, but it should make sense that the vagina is able to withstand a lot of punishment. I'm pretty sure Betty White had a famous quote that I actually dig with, and it makes sense for the purpose of anatomy and physiology. If you haven't heard the quote before, here it is. Why do people say grow some balls? Balls are weak and sensitive. If you want to be tough, grow a vagina. Those things can take a pounding. And while it is funny and chuckles and ha ha ha, it's seriously true. The testicles in the male system is incredibly fragile. Imagine having your ovaries on the outside, the most important thing in your body, arguably apart from your brain, because that's required to propagate the species. Those are touched, tapped, sat on, or injured in any way, massive pain and damage could occur. A vagina, on the other hand, has to withstand the frictional forces in sexual intercourse as well as childbirth. Those things are tough. It's why stratified squamous epithelium is there. There's mucus to provide lubrication and try to reduce the potential damage that it takes. Now, the epithelial cells secrete glycogen into the vaginal lumen. This is metabolized by resident bacteria, which generates lactic acid and helps maintain the acidic pH of this region. This is a symbiotic relationship between the body and the natural bacterial flora that lives in the vagina. Going all the way back to the lymphatic system, remember, for one, space is premium. Since there's already natural flora living there, the body is going to feed it to try to help promote that flora to continue to stay there so it doesn't have excess room for new bacteria to find a home. In addition, that lactic acid creates an acidic environment where not a lot of bacteria or viruses really like to live. So it's a symbiotic of essentially being like, hey body, thanks for the glycogen, I'm going to produce this acid so that no one else essentially can take my spot and you're going to be protected. Kind of beautiful how it works. Hymen. This is a vascular partition of mucosa near the distal vaginal orifice. It is commonly ruptured during first sexual intercourse. However, it is not always ruptured during first sexual intercourse. There are a variety of ways that it can be ruptured. I think a really common one is horseback riding. So it is not the end-all, be-all virginity test that it was back in, more, let's say, medieval times and things like that. Terrible system. All right, so we just finished talking about the internal genitalia for the female reproductive system, and now the external female genitalia. Here is essentially going to be a photo which you are able to study and link the words that I'm going to be saying above to the location below. So vulva is the external reproductive structures, which can consist of the mons, doesn't consist of it, that's a little bit later, mons pubis, the fatty rounded region overlapping the pubic symphysis, covered with hair after puberty, right up here. The labia major, a pair of elongated fatty protective skin folds. They lie posterior to the mons pubis. The labia minor, they're the pair of the thinner skin folds enclosed within the labia minor. The clitoris, it's anterior to the vestibule, a small protrusion composed of erectile tissue. So labia major, labia minor, the clitoris. This is the hole for your urethral orifice, where the urethra, urinary system, the vaginal orifice, which leads into the vagina, the peritoneum, which is this section here, mons pubis, which hide behind the pubic bones, external female genitalia. In addition, there is a photo on the PowerPoint talking about the mammary glands, which I think the most interesting thing about them is they are modified sweat glands, components of the integumentary system, whose primary biological role is to produce milk for the newborn infant. The areola, which is essentially the darker color around the nipple, it's the hyperpigmented region just below the center of each breast. That surrounds the nipple, and that's where milk exits. Milk passes from the alveoli into a series of mammary ducts. They flow into various ducts that open at the nipple. I'm not going to be going too in depth in terms of the mammary gland because this system, or this section, is a little bit more on the reproductive side instead of the developmental side. So just important to know this section right here. This, of course, is a table that summarizes everything that we just talked about. Again, this is rough anatomy and will make a lot more sense once we start adding physiology to it. However, some of the most important things to capture from this is going to be the internal genitalia. Why the female system is much more complex than the male primary ones is because it has to develop or support the developing embryo, provide nourishment to the growing infant, and then you'll be able to link the reasons why in the physiology sections. Ovaries are going to be the most important thing. You'll want to understand where these hormones are actually secreted from and what triggers it. And yeah, in the next video, we're going to get into the physiology of the female system and get ready. It's cool.